Yes, thank you, my lady. My lady, as you're aware, I address you on behalf of the long COVID groups. I have two preliminary points to make, followed by some procedural points. Overarching my submissions is this one simple point. Long COVID is a direct consequence of COVID-19 and must not be siphoned off into a separate investigation. To investigate the pandemic is to investigate long COVID. With this overarching point in mind, I make these short points, which I hope assist my lady. Vaccines and therapeutics. First, the long COVID groups raise with concern a topic that appears to have been raised by other core participants, that is the division of the topic of vaccines and therapeutics over modules 3 and 4. The long COVID groups are concerned specifically about the issue of vaccines and therapeutics insofar as they are significant to the incidence and severity of long COVID. There is evidence that vaccines are efficient at reducing the impact of long COVID on the overall population and in reducing the harm felt by individuals suffering from long COVID, matters to be considered within Module 3. Specifically, there is evidence that vaccinated individuals are less likely to develop long COVID from an acute infection, that vaccines alleviate pre-existing symptoms of long COVID, and that vaccines reduce the overall severity of long COVID symptoms, thereby reducing the overall prevalence of long COVID in the UK's population. The long COVID groups, as my lady is aware, have not been granted core participant status on Module 4 and have expressed their concern to you in that regard. Module 4 covers this topic as a whole, and it is noted that the decision letter refusing them core participant status suggests that the, quote, diagnosis and treatment of long COVID falls within the provisional outlined scope for Module 3. The long COVID groups wish to ensure, therefore, that the scope for Module 3 will accommodate the use of pharmaceutical interventions, that is, vaccines and therapeutics, for the prevention and treatment of long COVID. It is both necessary and proportionate that this issue is investigated during the course of the inquiry. People are continuing to suffer from long COVID. It endures. The long COVID groups seek to understand when and how the inquiry will investigate how vaccines and therapeutics can best be used to prevent and treat this illness. Children and young people. Turning to my second submission, my lady, I'm mindful that the experiences of children and young people is one that is close to your heart, and you have on several occasions raised the importance of hearing and understanding the experiences of children and young people to your inquiry. The inquiry needs to grapple with the roulette of COVID-19. Whilst most children suffer short, mild illness, some do not. It is very important that the experiences of children and young people that suffered from, and in some cases continue to suffer from long COVID, are not forgotten. As we have said, those children suffered the dual harms of the general impact of isolation and the loss of education had during the pandemic, as well as the physiological harms of long COVID. I refer you to the public testimonies of families, children and young people shared on the Long COVID Kids website. I have two brief examples to share, one from the perspective of a child and one from the perspective of their family. A child aged 8 said, "On big days out now, I now have to use my wheelchair because otherwise I get too tired and I would have an energy crash." B, the family of J, aged 12, said, "His life is unrecognizable now compared to pre-COVID. He has spent the last 2 years seeing doctors, visiting hospitals, taking supplements and medication, having physiotherapy and pacing. COVID literally knocked him off his feet." I'm sure you are cognizant of the profound impact that the sudden loss of health and enduring disability have on previously healthy children and young people. We have 3 requests on behalf of children with long COVID. A, that there is proper pediatric evidence. B, that the list of issues is amended to reflect the investigation into adults and children with long COVID. And C, concerns every story matters. Turning to the first point, the expert report of Dr. Breitling and Professor Breitling and Dr. Evans, whilst recognizing the harm caused by COVID to children that developed into long COVID, it is candid in its acceptance that those experts are not pediatricians and are not expert clinicians who are hands-on and treat children with long COVID. My lady, this leaves a gap in the evidence for this module of the inquiry, which is the absence of a properly resourced paediatric expert opinion. Children cannot and should not be compared to adults. Their experience is unique, as is their physiology. It is over a year until Module 3 starts, and we'd reiterate our request on behalf of our clients that the inquiry instructs a paediatric expert on long COVID. I note that this is likely to assist your investigation in the future module on children and education. My instructing team remain very open to meeting the inquiry team to discuss this constructively and offer suggestions. Secondly, the list of issues should be amended at paragraph 12A to include, in quotes, definition and diagnosis of long COVID in adults and children, close quotes. As suggested, it is important to specify the unique experience of children. Thirdly, in relation to Every Story Matters, long COVID groups are concerned that the current plan to research and review the experiences of children and young people will dilute and depersonalize the experiences of children and young people with long COVID. As matters stand, children and young people will not be heard either in the hearings or through Every Story Matters. The long COVID groups are concerned that those children with long COVID will be hidden in plain sight as a minority group under the crushing weight of the experiences of other children and young people. Our client, Long COVID Kids, has proposed that the listening exercise collects accounts from children in a personal manner. As your lady recognised, children's memories fade, but it seems taking children's accounts, whether that is individualised or otherwise, has still not yet happened. Long COVID Kids have further noted that younger children may not have the language to express their experiences, and artwork could be submitted instead. Our clients continue to work with the listening exercise team and would invite consideration of these proposals. Procedural matters. My lady, I will now turn to them. I have 4 submissions in regard to the list of issues, expert evidence and witness evidence. On the list of issues, we propose some amendments to paragraphs 6 and 7 of our written submissions, which we hope are of assistance to the inquiry, will ensure there is no misunderstanding, of the scope of investigation. We understand from Ms. Carey King's Counsel's submissions this morning that the list of issues is iterative, and we welcome this approach. At this stage, I raise only this. Long COVID is at the end of the list of issues, and I take no point with this other than to simply ask the inquiry legal team to ensure long COVID is not treated as a standalone, discrete issue, but as an important thread underlying the investigation in this module. This is borne out by the submissions for other core participants, the RCN, the TUC, CVF, that all refer to their members with long COVID. The centrality of long COVID as being a direct harm requires the following specific amendments to the list of issues. First, that the investigation of long COVID under paragraph 12 includes, in quotes, the recognition of long COVID as a disability, as called for by the TUC and the Royal College of Nurses, and, in quotes, recognition of long COVID as an occupational health disease. This is in line with the approach in other countries like the USA, where long COVID was recognized as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act as early as July 2021. That paragraph 4B, access to and use of primary care, be amended to include long COVID sufferers' access to primary care, especially in the early stages of the pandemic. And at paragraph 7A, impact of the pandemic on doctors, nurses, and other healthcare staff be expanded to expressly include the impact of long COVID. I note and commend to your team that compelling report from the British Medical Association overexposed and underprotected the long-term impact of COVID-19 on doctors, which sets out the brutal impact on long COVID on doctors as just one example.
Mr. Metzer, could I ask you to speak more slowly too, please, for the sake of the stenographer?
I'm very sorry, my lady. But do I need to repeat anything? Or
No. I think, but she's coping magnificently as ever, but struggling.
Of course, I shall slow down. Thank you.
So I share the same failing. I always speak too quickly too. So.
Thank you. I complete this by saying I invite detailed consideration of the amendments proposed at paragraph 6 of our written submissions regarding further lines of inquiry with long COVID, which we trust are of assistance to you and the inquiry legal team. My final point on the list of issues circles back to my first submission, that there has been no confirmation that Module 3 will consider treatments, antivirals, and impact of vaccines in reducing the incidence and severity of long COVID. The long COVID groups invite the inquiry to confirm that these pressing issues will be investigated in Module 3 or to confirm that they will be investigated in Module 4. We are grateful for the update on the long COVID expert report outlined earlier this morning and look forward to receiving the Module 3 part of the expert report. In regard to Professor Brightling and Dr. Evans' further report on long COVID from Module 3, we understand that this will address the treatment of long COVID, research and long-term management of the illness, their role in advising healthcare systems across the United Kingdom on their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and any further lessons. That's at page 47. Whilst it is understood that the Module 3 sections are in the process of being finalised, we ask that the inquiry ensure the following points will also be covered by the long COVID expert reports. First interventions to prevent the incidence of long COVID, A, being impact of vaccinations on the incidence of and severity of long COVID and effect of vaccinations on existing long COVID patients, and B, impact of treatment for acute COVID-19 infections, such as antivirals, on the incidence of long COVID. Secondly, surveillance systems for long COVID in patient electronic health records. We agree with the bereaved families for justice that there is a need for appropriate witness evidence in this module from those with lived experience. We note the BFFJ proposed to provide a schedule of families to provide evidence. Our clients have provided an extensive composite statement reflecting the experiences of their members and supporters of thousands, representing the estimated 2 million people that have suffered from long COVID. We would urge that our clients are also called to give oral evidence. They reflect the diverse experiences of accessing healthcare systems as an individual with long COVID, from ordinary working families to frontline healthcare workers as represented by long COVID physios. Every Story Matters. We would ask that the Every Story Matters lines of inquiry are amended to include experiences of having long COVID. One, the impact of lack of recognition of long COVID on people suffering with long COVID. And secondly, experiences of accessing healthcare for long COVID, including primary and secondary care, and the differential experiences of those who are hospitalized for COVID-19 and those who experienced infections in the community. Finally, practical suggestions. Long COVID groups note with concern the delays outlined by Ms. Carey, King's Counsel, this morning of certain key government bodies responding to Rule 9 requests, specifically the significant delays by the Department of Health and Social DHSC and UKHSA, key to this module. At this stage, we simply share the inquiry team's observation that this delay is unreasonable and is unnecessarily delaying the important work of this inquiry. The long COVID groups also note the submissions advanced by other core participants, namely the Bereaved Families for Justice, in regard to the hearing timetable. The long COVID groups have one simple observation in this regard, which is that the timetable be agile enough to adequately accommodate the number of issues listed as being investigated in the scope, and that there is sufficient time allocated to hear impact evidence from those affected. The long COVID groups note that the timetabling of impact evidence was strained in Module 2 and hope that Module 3 will allot sufficient time to properly accommodate the hearing of this important evidence. At this stage, and without a clear sense of the number of witnesses to be called, that is all the long COVID groups wish to raise about the final.